Abigail Carter slammed the foreclosure notice onto the feed store counter so hard the inkwell jumped. "I want every horse in this county that's too old, too lame, or too broken for anybody else to want," she said, her voice shaking with something colder than grief. 20 of them, by Friday. The room went dead silent, then erupted into laughter. A woman about to lose everything spending her last dollars on animals fit for the glue man. But Abigail Carter wasn't asking. She was daring the whole town to stop her. If stories like this stir something in you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me till the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The laughter followed her out the door and into the street, and Abigail led it. She'd learned that much in the 11 months since her father died. You let the laughter wash over you like rain, because fighting it only made you wetter. 20 horses, someone repeated behind her, wheezing with amusement. Lord have mercy, she means it. She didn't turn around. She walked straight down the middle of Main Street with her father's notebook clutched against her ribs, and the foreclosure notice folded into her coat pocket like a knife she intended to use on someone someday if she ever figured out who deserved it. 90 days. That was what Nathan Reed had given her, standing in her own parlor with his hat in his hands, like a man delivering a funeral eulogy instead of a death sentence. 90 days to pay, 11 months of back payments on a ranch that hadn't produced a decent crop in 2 years, or the bank would take the land her father had bled for. She'd asked him straight to his face. "Did you sleep well last night, Mr. Reed?" He'd blinked at her. "Ma'am, just wondering if a man sleeps easy taking a dead man's land from his daughter." He'd left without answering that. Now she stood in the middle of the street with the whole town watching her from doorways and porches, waiting to see what the widow Carter would do next, and she felt the old fury rise up in her chest like floodwater with nowhere to go. "Miss Carter," the voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, nothing like the mocking calls from the feed store. She turned and found a stranger standing at the edge of the boardwalk, holding the reins of a rangy bay gelding that looked like it had walked clear from Wyoming without stopping to eat. The man himself looked much the same, lean to the point of gaunt, unshaven, a coat gone thin at the elbows. But his eyes were steady in a way that made her want to trust him and hate herself for wanting to. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "Jesse Calloway." He tipped his hat, a small, economical gesture, nothing showy about it. "Couldn't help but hear what you said back there." "Half the county heard what I said back there." Most of the county laughed. He didn't. That was the first thing she noticed about him, that he stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his face perfectly serious, like she'd said something worth taking seriously, instead of something worth mocking. "I didn't." "Why not?" "Because I've got 4 horses out past the Miller place that nobody wants either. Old stock. Man who owned them died owing money, and the bank's fixing to shoot them rather than feed them through winter." His jaw tightened on the word shoot. "I've been trying to find somebody fool enough to take them off my hands before that happens. Reckon you might be the first fool I've met all week who'd actually say yes." Abigail studied him for a long moment. He didn't look away, didn't fidget, didn't do any of the things men usually did when a widow looked at them too long and too hard. "I'll take them," she said. "You don't want to know what's wrong with them first. Mr. Calloway, I just told the entire feed store I wanted 20 horses nobody else would have. I expect that comes with some understanding of what condition they'll be in." Something shifted in his face then, not quite a smile, but close to it, like a door easing open a crack. "No, ma'am. I don't suppose it takes much explaining." He paused. "Where's your place?" "Carter Ranch, 4 miles north past the creek bend." "I'll bring them by tomorrow." He swung up onto the bay, then hesitated, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something, Miss Carter?" "You can ask. Everybody back there thinks you've lost your mind." He tilted his head toward the feed store. "You don't strike me as a woman who's lost her mind." "I haven't." "Then why do it 20 broken horses on a ranch that can't feed itself?" She almost told him the truth then about her father's notebook. about the one unfinished sentence that had kept her up 3 nights running, about the desperate, foolish hope that had planted itself in her chest and refused to be reasoned out. But she'd learned something else in 11 months of widowhood. You didn't hand your last piece of hope to a stranger on the street, not even one with steady eyes and a gentle way of asking, because everyone else has already decided those horses are worthless, she said instead. And I've had about enough of people deciding things are worthless before they've bothered to look close. He held her gaze a moment longer, and she thought maybe he understood more than she'd said. "Tomorrow, then," he said, and rode off north without looking back. The bank sat at the corner of Main and 4th, a square brick building that looked to Abigail's eye entirely too pleased with itself. Nathan Reed's office was in the back, and his clerk tried to tell her he was occupied, but she walked past the man anyway and pushed open the door. Reed looked up from his ledger, startled, then resigned, like a man who'd been expecting this visit and dreading it in equal measure. "Mrs. Carter, I want to know something, Mr. Reed." She didn't sit. She stood in front of his desk with her hands folded and her spine straight, the way her mother had taught her to stand when she was young and angry, and needed the anger to look like dignity instead. "Did my father owe this bank money, or did this bank simply decide it wanted his land? Your father owed. I've seen the books, Mr. Reed. I spent 3 nights going through every ledger he left behind, and I can't find where the debt you're claiming actually comes from. I find loans, I find payments, I find a man who paid every note he ever signed right up until the drought took his crops 2 years running." She leaned forward slightly. "What I don't find is 11 months of missed payments. I find 4. Reed's face did something complicated. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over. "There were additional fees, late penalties, compounding interest." "Show me." "I don't have to show you anything, Mrs. Carter. You're not the account holder. Your father was, and now that he's passed, the debt falls to me. Yes, which means I'm entitled to see exactly what I owe and why." She held his eyes. "Unless there's a reason you'd rather I didn't look too closely." The silence stretched long enough that she knew she'd struck something true, even if she couldn't yet prove what it was. 90 days, Reed said, finally, his voice flat. "That's what the board approved. I can't change that. I'm not asking you to change it." She straightened, turned toward the door, then paused. "I'm telling you, I intend to use every one of those 90 days, Mr. Reed. And I'd think hard about what happens to a bank's reputation in this county if it turns out to have been squeezing a grieving widow over numbers that don't add up." She left him sitting there with his ledger open and his face gone pale, and she didn't look back to see whether he believed her threat. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. But she'd learned that too in 11 months. Sometimes you said the brave thing before you felt it, and the feeling caught up later, or it didn't, and either way, you'd already said it. Her father's notebook lived in the top drawer of the roll-top desk in what had been his study, and was now by necessity hers. She sat with it that night by lamplight, running her thumb over the worn leather cover, the way she'd done every night since the funeral, as if enough touching might wear a door into it, and let her climb inside and ask him what he meant. The land isn't dead. The water simply forgot where to go. That was all he'd written on the second-to-last page in handwriting that had grown shaky toward the end. No explanation. No map. Just that one sentence underlined twice like a man leaving a message he expected someone to understand, even though he hadn't managed to write down the rest of it before his heart gave out in the Eastfield on a Tuesday morning in September. "What did you mean, Papa?" she asked the empty room, and the empty room, as always, didn't answer. She'd asked Samuel Brooks about it 3 days ago, walked out to his little house past the church, because everyone said old Samuel had been a drainage engineer once, back before his hands got too stiff for the fine work. He'd read the sentence twice, then looked up at her with an expression she hadn't expected. "Your father ever mentioned the old Hendricks survey?" he'd asked. "No. Before the war there was talk of running drainage channels under half this valley. Whole system of them meant to pull water off the bottomland so it could be farmed instead of just sitting there useless. Hendricks got as far as digging some of it before the money ran out, and the war came and swallowed the rest. Samuel had set the notebook down carefully like it might break. Man who surveyed that land was your grandfather, Mrs. Carter. I believe your father knew exactly where some of those channels ran. I believe he spent the last years of his life trying to remember. Then why didn't he just tell me? Samuel had looked at her with something like pity and something like respect mixed together in equal measure. Grief does strange things to a man's memory near the end. Maybe he was still trying to remember it himself when his heart gave out. He'd hesitated. There's a way to find out, though. If you're willing to try something folks around here will think is pure foolishness. I've already committed myself to foolishness once today, Mr. Brooks. I don't imagine one more will kill me. He'd almost smiled at that. Horses know ground, Mrs. Carter. Better than men do sometimes. An old horse, one that's spent its life pulling wagons and plows, learns to feel where the earth gives soft and where it holds firm. If there's channels under that bottomland, old brick, old stone-packed earth over hollow ground, a horse walking loose across it will find the difference before any man with a shovel does. That was the moment the number 20 had come into her head, whole and certain. The way her father used to say, the right decisions arrived not built up piece by piece, but dropped in all at once like a stone into still water. 20 horses. Old ones. Broken ones. Nobody else's horses, because nobody else believed they were worth anything, which meant nobody else would miss them, which meant she could turn them loose across that ruined bottomland and let them walk the answer into being one careful hoofstep at a time. She'd gone straight to the feed store from Samuel's porch, and now here she sat with the notebook in her lap and Jesse Calloway's steady eyes still somewhere in the back of her thoughts, refusing to leave the way strangers' eyes weren't supposed to linger. He came the next morning at first light, just as he'd said, leading 4 horses on a rope line behind the bay gelding. Abigail stood at the fence and watched them come, a sway-backed mare, with cataract-clouded eyes, a gelding missing most of one ear, 2 others thin enough that their ribs stood out like fence rails under dull coats. "Lord," she breathed. "Told you they weren't much to look at." Jesse swung down and started working the rope loose. This old girl's Bess. Pulled a freight wagon 15 years before her owner died, and his son decided feeding her wasn't worth the trouble. Can't hardly see past 10 feet, but her legs are sound, and there ain't a smarter animal in this county, blind or not. How do you know that? Because I've been sleeping in that barn with them for 2 weeks, trying to keep the bank from putting them down before I found somewhere to send them. He said it plainly without asking for sympathy, but Abigail felt something in her chest twist anyway. "You've been sleeping in a barn." "Wasn't going to let them die alone, ma'am, if I could help it." He finished with the rope and straightened, meeting her eyes. "Some folks would say that's foolish, too. Some folks have said a great many foolish things to me this week, Mr. Calloway. I've stopped putting much stock in what they think." That almost smile again, quick and gone. "Where do you want them?" "East pasture. Turn them loose if you don't mind, no lead ropes, no fences pushing them one way or another. I want to see where they walk on their own." He gave her a curious look, but didn't argue, and together they walked the 4 horses out past the barn, toward the low bottomland, where her father's cornfields used to stand, green and tall, before the water problem swallowed them whole. 16 more horses arrived over the following 4 days, some from Jesse, who seemed to know every abandoned, half-starved, forgotten animal within 20 miles, and some from her own scraping together of what little money remained in the strongbox her father had left behind. By the end of the week, 20 horses stood scattered across 100 acres of useless swamp, and half the county had ridden out just to see the spectacle of a grieving widow's ruin made complete. "She's finally cracked," she heard one man mutter to another, not quietly enough, as they sat their horses at the fence line and watched her work. "Buying dying animals to stand in a dead field. Reed'll have this place inside 60 days, mark me." Jesse, standing beside her with a coil of rope over his shoulder, turned toward the fence with an expression gone hard and flat. "You want me to go tell them something, Miss Carter?" "No." She kept her eyes on the horses. "Let them watch. Let them laugh. I'd rather they see the whole thing happen than only hear about it after. Awful lot of confidence for a woman standing in a swamp. Awful lot of faith, Mr. Calloway. There's a difference. She glanced sideways at him. You didn't have to stay and help this long. You could have dropped those 4 horses and ridden on. Could have. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But something had settled between them over the 4 days of hauling water and mending fence and standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud. Not quite friendship yet, but the first rough shape of it, the way a fence post stands before anyone's, strung the wire. That evening, as the sun dropped low and orange over the western ridge, Abigail walked the fence line alone and watched old Bess, blind in one eye and half in the other, wander slow and unhurried across ground that had swallowed men's boots to the ankle for 2 years running. The mare stopped, turned her head, stamped once twice against the earth, the way a horse does when something underfoot doesn't sit right. Abigail's breath caught. She marked the spot with a stone before the light failed entirely, and she carried that stone back to the house cradled in both hands, like it might be the most valuable thing she owned, because for the first time in 11 months, standing in a swamp, everyone else had already given up on. She let herself believe her father might have been right. The stone stayed in her pocket through supper, through the long silence after Jessie rode back to the lean-to he'd fixed up in her barn, through the hours she should have spent sleeping, and didn't. By midnight, she'd lit the lamp again, and was back at the roll-top desk notebook, open the stone sitting beside it like a small gray promise she was afraid to trust. Samuel arrived before sunup exactly as he'd said he would when she sent word by the Miller boy the evening before. He came on a mule so old it looked half asleep even while walking, and he climbed down slow joints, complaining audibly, and looked at her with the particular sharpness of a man who hadn't slept much either. "You marked something," he said. "Not a question." Bess did. Stopped dead, stamped the ground twice, wouldn't move another step till I led her off it myself. "Show me." They walked out together into gray morning light, Abigail's boots sinking to the ankle in mud that hadn't dried in 2 years. Samuel picking his way with a cane he claimed he didn't need, but carried anyway. The stone she'd left the night before sat exactly where she'd placed it, and Samuel crouched beside it with a grunt of effort, pressing his palm flat against the earth like he was taking its pulse. "Feel that," he said. "Feel what? Put your hand down, right here." She knelt beside him, sank her palm into cold mud, and felt nothing at first, just wet ground, same as every other wet acre of this ruined bottomland. Then, faint as a held breath, she felt it. A firmness beneath the give. Something solid 2 feet down that didn't belong in a swamp. "That's brick," Samuel said quietly. "Or I'm a Chinaman." "You're certain?" "I've put my hands on enough drainage tile in my life to know the feel of it through mud, Mrs. Carter. That's channel work. Old channel work packed over and forgotten, same as your father wrote." He looked up at her, and something in his weathered face had gone bright with an excitement he probably hadn't felt in years. "Your horse just found it." Behind them, Jessie had come up quiet, leading 2 more of the rescued horses out to pasture, and he stopped at the fence rail to watch. "Found what?" "The whole reason this ranch might still be standing come harvest," Abigail said, and for the first time in 11 months her voice didn't shake with grief when she said something about her father's land. It shook with something closer to hope, which frightened her almost as much. They marked the spot with a stake driven deep enough to hold, and then Abigail turned the rest of the horses loose across the bottomland one by one, watching each animal's gait, each hesitation, each place where a hoof came down too careful or a head came up too sharp. It was slow work, maddening work. A dozen times that first morning, she thought she saw a horse pause meaningfully, only to have it simply be shying at a burr or a fly. And each false hope cost her something small she couldn't afford to keep losing. But by midday, she had 6 stakes driven into the mud, forming a rough line that curved from the northeast corner of the pasture down toward the creek, and when Samuel walked the line with his cane tapping the ground at intervals, he went quiet in a way that made her stomach drop. "What?" she said. "Tell me." "This isn't a single channel, Mrs. Carter." He straightened, wincing at his own knees. This is a junction. Multiple lines meeting at one point, likely feeding down toward the creek for drainage. Your grandfather didn't dig a ditch. He built a system. How big a system? Can't rightly say without more digging. Could be this pasture alone. Could run clean under half the valley, same as I told you before. He looked out over the bottomland with an expression she couldn't fully read, awe maybe, or grief for time lost, or both at once. Whole thing got buried and forgotten, same as everything else the war swallowed up. Jessie had come to stand at her shoulder close enough that she felt the warmth of him even through the damp morning chill. What's it mean for the corn? Means if we can clear even a portion of it, Samuel said. Get the water moving off this bottomland, the way it's meant to, this ground'll grow anything you plant in it. Best soil in the county's probably sitting right under our boots, drowned for 30 years, because nobody remembered how to let it breathe. Abigail looked out at the 100 acres of mud and ruin that had swallowed her father's hope, and very nearly swallowed her own, and she felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite joy, not yet, but the first thin crack of light through a door she'd believed sealed for good. Then we start digging, she said. Today. Samuel's face went careful. Mrs. Carter, I want you to understand what you're asking. 30 years of collapsed earth, buried tile, God knows what state of decay. This isn't work for 3 people and 20 horses. This is work for a crew and time and money you don't have. I have 90 days, Mr. Brooks, 86 now, and I have exactly the crew standing in this pasture. She turned to look at him, then at Jessie, and something fierce and unyielding settled into her voice. It'll have to be enough, because it's all I've got. The digging began that afternoon and did not stop in any meaningful sense for the next 11 days. Jessie worked like a man who'd decided somewhere along the way that this fight had become his own shirt, soaked through by mid-morning hands blistering and then calloused, never once complaining. Even when Abigail caught him wincing at wounds he tried to hide from her. Samuel directed from the edge of the trench when his knees allowed and climbed down into it stubbornly, when they didn't, muttering about buried tile and cracked mortar and channels that hadn't seen daylight since before the war. And Abigail dug alongside them both, because she'd be damned if anyone said afterward that Carter land had been saved by everyone except a Carter. The first channel they uncovered ran 12 feet before it collapsed into rubble. Old brick crumbled to dust. The whole section useless, and Abigail stood over the wreckage on the 3rd day, with her hands raw and her spirit raw, feeling the 90 days tick down, like a clock she could hear even in her sleep. It's not all like this, Samuel said, seeing her face. Some of it'll be sound. Has to be. Your grandfather built to last. And if it isn't, he didn't answer that, and his silence told her more than any words could have. That night, sitting on the porch step with the lamp behind her, throwing long shadows across the yard, Jessie came and sat beside her without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You're thinking too loud, he said. I can hear it from the barn. I'm thinking about 83 days and 100 acres of collapsed channel and a bank that's counting every one of those days, same as I am. Reckon that's worth thinking about. He was quiet a moment, turning his hat over in his hands. But you found brick today. Sound brick near the second stake. Samuel said so himself before you got too deep in your own head to hear him. 1 good section out of 6. 1 good section further than anybody in this county thought you'd get. Including, if I'm honest, me that first day when I heard you standing in the feed store asking for horses nobody wanted. He glanced sideways at her. I came out here half expecting to find a woman who'd lost her grip on things, ma'am. Wasn't sure what I'd say to her when I did. And what did you find instead? Found a woman digging in the mud at first light with her own 2 hands, refusing to let anybody else carry the worst of it for her. He held her eyes, and something in his voice went low and careful, like a man handling something he didn't want to break. Made me want to stay and dig alongside her is what it made me want to do. Abigail felt her breath catch, and she looked away first, out toward the dark shape of the bottomland, where 20 horses stood grazing under starlight. You could still leave Mr. Calloway. Nobody would think less of you for it. This isn't your fight. Wasn't your father's death that made it his fight either. Jesse said quietly. Was somebody deciding to love this land enough to bleed for it? Reckon I understand that particular kind of foolishness better than most. She didn't ask him what he meant by that. Not that night, but she felt the weight of unspoken history in the words, and she filed it away alongside the stone in her pocket. Another small thing she was collecting without quite knowing what she meant to build from it. On the 5th day, disaster arrived, wearing Nathan Reed's face. He rode out unannounced, dressed too fine for a working ranch, and sat his horse at the fence line watching them dig, with an expression of poorly hidden satisfaction that made Abigail's jaw tighten before he'd said a single word. Mrs. Carter. He tipped his hat, the gesture somehow managing to feel like an insult. Heard you'd taken to digging up your own pasture. Didn't believe it till I saw it with my own eyes. Then you've seen it, Mr. Reed. Was there something else you needed, or did you ride 4 miles simply to watch? Boards asked me to remind you the terms haven't changed. 90 days from the notice full payment or the note comes due in whole. Digging holes in a swamp doesn't change the calendar. I'm aware of how calendars work, Mr. Reed. His eyes moved past her to the trench, to Samuel standing waist-deep in it with a piece of broken brick in his hand, to Jesse leaning on a shovel, with sweat darkening his shirt, and an expression that had gone flat and watchful the moment Reed appeared. Something flickered across the banker's face, not quite worry, but close to it, quickly smoothed away. You found something down there, he said. It wasn't a question. We're looking for something. There's a difference, same as I told Mr. Calloway not long ago. What exactly are you looking for, if you don't mind my asking? I do mind, actually. She kept her voice pleasant, which cost her considerable effort. But since you've ridden all this way, I'll tell you this much. My grandfather built drainage under this land before the war. We're clearing it out. If it works the way Mr. Brooks believes it will, this bottomland will grow corn again by fall. Reed's face did something complicated. Then something she filed away next to the unexplained missing 7 months of debt, next to the strange urgency of the foreclosure, next to a dozen small wrongnesses she hadn't yet found the shape of. That's a great deal of faith to place in old rumors, Mrs. Carter. It's not rumor, Mr. Reed. It's brick and mortar buried 30 years and still sound where the collapse hasn't reached it. I'm happy to show you if you'd like to climb down into the mud and see for yourself. He did not take her up on the offer. He sat his horse a moment longer, gaze flicking once more toward the trench, toward the stakes, marking a line that curved toward the creek, and something in the careful way he studied that line made the hair on the back of Abigail's neck rise, though she couldn't have said why. 85 days, he said finally, and turned his horse without further pleasantry, riding back toward town, at a pace just slightly faster than the visit had warranted. Jesse came to stand beside her, watching the dust settle behind Reed's horse. Man didn't come out here just to remind you of a deadline he could have sent by letter. No, Abigail said slowly. He didn't. What do you reckon he wanted? I don't know yet. She looked back toward the line of stakes, toward the trench where Samuel was already climbing back down to resume work, oblivious to everything except the puzzle of buried brick in front of him. But I intend to find out. Chuckag. The 7th day brought the second twist, and it came without warning, the way the worst ones always did. Abigail was down in the trench herself, working alongside Jesse to clear collapsed brick from a stretch near the 4th stake, when her shovel struck something that wasn't stone or tile. She dropped to her knees in the mud and dug with her bare hands, heart hammering, and pulled free a section of iron pipe rusted through in places, but unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably modern, nothing like the old brick channels her grandfather had built. Samuel, she called, voice tight. Samuel, come look at this. He climbed down, slow, took the pipe from her hands, turned it over, and his face went pale under its weathering. This isn't your grandfather's work, he said. Then whose is it? This is new iron. Mrs. Carter, 10 years old, maybe less. Somebody's been down here since your grandfather's time running pipe through this same system. He looked up at her, and something in his eyes had gone hard and afraid at once. Somebody who knew exactly what was buried under this land and went to considerable trouble to make use of it without your father ever knowing. Jessie had gone very still beside her. Use it for what? I don't rightly know yet. Samuel turned the pipe over again, tracing a section where it had been cut clean deliberately, not by decay, but by a saw. But I intend to follow this line and find out where it goes. They followed it for 2 hours, digging where they had to, tracing where the ground allowed, and the pipe led them steadily northeast, away from the creek, away from Carter land, entirely toward a boundary line Abigail knew as well as her own name, toward the Miller property. Toward the very edge of land the railroad had been quietly buying up for the better part of 2 years, according to talk she'd half listened to at church and dismissed as nothing to do with her. She stood at the boundary stake with mud to her elbows and a section of stolen iron pipe in her hands, and something cold and furious settled into her chest. "They've been draining water off Carter land," she said slowly, "and running it onto Miller land. On purpose." "Why would anybody do that?" Jessie asked. "Because dry land sells for railroad right-of-way," Samuel said quietly. "And swampland doesn't. Somebody's been keeping this bottom land flooded on purpose, Mrs. Carter, so your father would fail, and the railroad could buy this ranch for a fraction of what it's worth once the water's gone." He set the pipe down carefully, like it was evidence in a trial, which perhaps it was. "The question now is who?" Abigail thought of Nathan Reed sitting his horse at the fence line, studying the line of stakes, with far too much interest for a man simply collecting on a debt. She thought of 7 months of mysterious fees that didn't add up in her father's ledgers. She thought of 90 days, ticking down like a clock, built by someone who already knew exactly how this story was supposed to end. "I think I know exactly who," she said. "Miag." That night, she couldn't sleep. And she wasn't the only one. She found Jessie sitting on the corral fence in the dark, watching the horses move like pale shapes in the starlight, and she climbed up beside him without a word. The way she'd have never done a month ago before, mud and blistered hands and shared exhaustion had worn away some careful boundary she used to keep between herself and strangers. "Can't stop thinking about that pipe," he said. "Neither can I. If Reed's behind it, if the bank's been working with the railroad to starve your father's land on purpose, that's not just cruelty, Miss Carter. That's a crime a man could hang for, or near enough." "I know it." "You'll need proof. More than a length of pipe and a hunch." "I know that too." She wrapped her arms around herself against the night chill, watching Bess move slow and blind and unbothered among the other horses. "But I intend to get it, Mr. Calloway, however long it takes." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rougher, more careful. "You remind me of somebody you know. Somebody I lost." "Your wife." The question surprised even her coming out before she'd decided to ask it, but he didn't flinch from it the way she half expected. "My sister," he said. "Older than me by 6 years. Raised cattle out past Cheyenne after our folks died, refused to sell, even when every man in the county told her a woman couldn't run a spread alone. Held on 3 years through drought and rustlers and men who thought her stubbornness was an invitation." His jaw worked. Bank took the land anyway. Wasn't fair, wasn't right, wasn't anything but men with money deciding a woman's grit didn't count for much against their ledgers. What happened to her? Moved east. Married a shopkeeper. Doesn't ride anymore, doesn't fight anymore, doesn't hardly look like the woman I grew up admiring. He looked at Abigail, then steady and open, in a way that made her chest ache. "I've been riding this territory 2 years, since finding horses. Nobody wants telling myself it's just kindness to dumb animals. Maybe it was something else. Maybe I've been looking for a chance to stand beside somebody fighting the same fight my sister lost and do it different this time." Abigail didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and they sat together on the fence in silence that felt less like absence of words and more like the words simply weren't needed yet. Not this particular night, not with grief and hope and something new and unnamed, all tangled together too tightly to separate. The 8th day brought Samuel with news that changed everything again. He arrived before breakfast, moving faster than Abigail had ever seen him move, waving a folded paper over his head as he came up the porch steps. "Land office records," he said, breathless. Took me half the night riding to Bozeman and back, but I found what I needed. Found what? Railroad's been buying options on land throughout this valley for 2 years. Quiet purchases, small parcels. Nothing that'd draw much notice on its own. But every parcel connects Mrs. Carter. Every single one forming a corridor straight through this valley toward the mountain pass. He spread the paper on the table, hands shaking slightly with either exhaustion or excitement, she couldn't tell which. Carter land sits square in the middle of that corridor. Has for 2 years. Which means somebody's had considerable motive to see this ranch fail and fall into hands willing to sell. Reed's hands. Reed's name isn't on a single one of these purchases, Samuel said carefully. But look here. He pointed to a signature at the bottom of one document, a name Abigail didn't recognize at first glance. Silas Whitfield, filed as land agent for the Montana Northern Railway. And look at the date on this one. His finger moved to another document, a small notation nearly lost among the formal language. Filed the same week your father's foreclosure notice went to the bank board for approval. Abigail felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the way it had the day the doctor told her about her father's heart. You're saying the timing isn't coincidence. I'm saying a foreclosure notice doesn't get approved by a bank board without somebody bringing it forward first. And I'm saying whoever brought it forward did so the very same week a railroad agent quietened down considerable interest in this exact parcel of land. Samuel folded his hands, and his old eyes had gone hard in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I've lived in this county 40 years, Mrs. Carter. I've seen greed dressed up in a great many disguises. This is one of the uglier ones. Jesse, who'd come in partway through and stood listening with his arms crossed, spoke low and even. So what do we do with it? We can't accuse a man of fraud on stakes and a pipe and a signature that matches nothing else we've got, Abigail said, though the fury in her voice belied the careful reasoning. We need proof that connects Reed directly, something he can't argue away. Then we keep digging, Samuel said. Both kinds, the bottomland and this. The next 3 days brought the drainage system fully into the light for the first time in 30 years, and with it came the discovery that shifted everything a second time. The main junction, the one Bess had first marked with her stamping hoof, turned out to be more extensive than even Samuel had guessed. A stone chamber roughly the size of a small room built to channel water from 6 separate lines down toward the creek, in a system so deliberately engineered that Samuel stood inside it the first afternoon with tears standing openly in his eyes. Your grandfather was a genius, he said quietly. Built to last 100 years if it had ever been allowed to run free. Can we fix it? The chamber's sound. 3 of the 6 lines are clear or clearable, but... He hesitated, and Abigail's stomach dropped at the hesitation. The main outflow where the whole system's meant to empty into the creek has collapsed entirely. Looks deliberate to my eye, not decay. Somebody blocked it on purpose sometime in the last several years, likely around the same time that iron pipe got laid to reroute water onto Miller land. How bad is the collapse? Bad enough that clearing it by hand with the tools we've got could take 3 weeks we don't have. He looked at her, and his voice gentled the way it did when he was about to deliver news he knew would hurt. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Abigail stood in the mouth of the stone chamber her grandfather had built, feeling 79 days shrink down toward something that no longer felt like enough, and for the first time since the feed store, she felt the cold edge of real despair creeping in at the borders of her resolve. Jesse must have seen it in her face because he stepped closer. Voice low. 3 weeks by hand. What about horses? Samuel blinked. What do you mean? You said yourself these animals can feel where the ground's sound and where it isn't. What if we rig something drag lines, pulleys, let the horses do the pulling instead of our backs? Could speed the clearing considerable, especially on the collapsed section, if we can get enough leverage to shift the larger stone without breaking our own bones doing it. Samuel's face went thoughtful, then slowly cautiously hopeful. It might work. It might actually work if we rig it careful. He looked between the two of them, something almost like wonder crossing his weathered features. You two have been solving this problem together 3 days running, without either of you seeming to notice you were doing it. Abigail felt heat rise in her face and refused to look at Jesse directly, though she felt his gaze on her all the same. "We don't have time for noticing much of anything except the work in front of us, Mr. Brooks." "No?" Samuel agreed, though something in his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe her. "Reckon you don't." They rigged the pulley system over the next 2 days, and it was Bess, blind, half-lame, dismissed by everyone in town as worthless, who proved the linchpin of the entire operation. The old mare took to the harness like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this work, pulling steady and patient, while Jesse guided the rope and Abigail and Samuel worked to clear stone as it shifted free. The collapse gave way on the 11th day all at once in a rush of freed water that came pouring down the cleared channel with a sound like the whole valley exhaling after holding its breath for 30 years. Abigail stood at the edge of the chamber and watched water move where it hadn't moved in 3 decades, and she wept openly without shame, the way she hadn't allowed herself to weep even at her father's funeral, because there'd been no room for weeping, then only the cold necessity of surviving what came next. "Papa," she said to no one, to everyone, to the water itself as it found its forgotten path toward the creek. "You were right. You were right the whole time." Jesse came to stand beside her, careful not to crowd her grief with anything so clumsy as words, and after a while, when the worst of it had passed, she reached over, without quite deciding to, and found his hand with hers, muddy fingers lacing through muddy fingers, and he held on like he understood exactly what the gesture cost her and exactly what it meant. "First dry ground in 2 years," Samuel said, wonder thick in his voice, watching the water recede from the nearest section of bottomland even as they stood there. "By week's end, you'll be able to walk this pasture without sinking to your knees." "And by month's end?" Abigail asked, wiping her face with the back of one filthy hand. "By month's end, if the weather holds and the rest of the system clears, the way I expect it will, you'll have soil rich enough to grow the finest corn this county's seen in a decade. 30 years of trapped nutrients released all at once." Samuel's voice had gone rough with something like reverence. "Your grandfather's dream come true a lifetime late, but come true all the same." The town's laughter changed pitch before the week was out. It started small. A rider passing on the road, who slowed to stare at pasture that had gone from swamp to solid ground in the space of days, and rode on without a word, but with an expression that had lost some of its former mockery. Then 2 men from the feed store, the very ones who'd laughed loudest that first morning, rode out on a Sunday afternoon, under the pretense of checking on a stray cow, and stayed an hour longer than any stray cow required, watching the drainage work with open fascination. "Didn't believe it?" one of them admitted when Abigail caught him staring and didn't pretend otherwise. "Genuinely didn't believe a word of it when you stood in my store asking for 20 broken horses. Thought grief had finally took your mind clean off." "I know you did, Mr. Fitch. Owe you an apology, I reckon, for laughing along with the rest." "You owe me nothing, Mr. Fitch. Save your apology for the day you see corn growing where this swamp used to be. That's the apology that'll mean something." He'd ridden off looking thoughtful, and Abigail had turned back to the trench with something warm and unfamiliar loosening in her chest. Not triumph exactly, not yet, but the first thin edge of vindication, sweeter than she'd expected, and more fragile than she wanted to admit. The third major twist arrived on the 14th day, and it arrived in the worst possible form: fire. Abigail woke past midnight to the smell of smoke and Jesse's voice shouting her name from the yard, raw with an urgency that had her out of bed and into her boots before her mind had fully caught up with her body. She burst through the front door to find the barn's near corner, already burning orange light, licking up the old wood faster than seemed natural, and the horses screaming inside in a way that turned her blood to ice. "The horses!" she screamed, already running. Jesse caught her arm before she reached the door, his grip iron hard. Fire's spreading too fast for a natural start. "Abigail, this was set. You go in there, you don't come back out." "I'm not leaving them to burn." "Neither am I. But we do it smart, or we don't do it at all." His eyes were fierce in the firelight, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw real fear in his face. Not for himself. She understood in a flash of terrible clarity, but for her. "Stay behind me. We open every stall, we drive them out the far end away from the flame. You hear me?" She heard him. She followed him into smoke thick enough to choke on, hands shaking as she fumbled stall latches. Bess's blind eyes wide with terror as Abigail pulled her free and slapped her flank hard enough to send her running for the open air. One by one, they freed the horses, choking eyes streaming, until only the last stall remained, the gray gelding, the weakest of the 20. The one everyone in town had called worthless from the very first day. He'd gone down. Collapsed in the smoke, legs tangled, too weak or too frightened to rise, and Jesse was already reaching for him when a support beam gave way overhead, with a crack like gunfire dropping burning wood between them and the stall door. "Jesse, I've got him." He was on his knees beside the gelding, pulling at the tangled rope with burned fingers, and the flame was climbing the far wall, now close enough that Abigail felt the heat of it against her own skin like a living thing. "There's no time." "There's time." He got the rope free, hauled the gelding up by main force, and shoved the animal toward the door, hard enough that it stumbled out into the yard, on its own legs, a heartbeat before the roof groaned overhead. A sound of surrender that meant they had seconds, not minutes. Jesse now. He turned, and for one terrible moment, their eyes met across 10 feet of smoke and collapsing timber. And Abigail understood with sudden gutting clarity exactly how much this man had come to mean to her in 14 short days. Understood it the way you understand a wound, only once it's already been made. Then he was moving fast, low diving through the gap in the flame with his coat already smoking, and she caught him as he stumbled clear. Both of them collapsing into the mud of the yard as the barn roof finally gave way behind them in a roar of sparks and falling timber. They lay there a moment, coughing alive, 20 horses standing scattered and terrified across the dark yard, but every single one of them breathing, every single one of them saved. "You're burned," Abigail managed, staring at his hands. "I'll live." He was staring at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain. "Thought I'd lost you in there, when that beam came down." "I'm fine, Jesse." "I know you're fine. Doesn't mean I wasn't scared out of my mind thinking you weren't going to be." His voice cracked on the words raw in a way she'd never heard from him before, and before either of them quite decided to let it happen, his hand had found her face, thumb brushing soot from her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted every callus on his palm. "Somebody set that fire," Abigail said softly, though every part of her wanted to stay exactly where she was and not think about anything beyond the warmth of his hand against her skin. "I know it." His jaw hardened, though his hand didn't move. "And I think we both know who'd have reason to want this barn burned to the ground 2 weeks before your 90 days are up." Behind them, the barn continued its slow collapse into embers, and somewhere in the dark yard, Bess whickered low and mournful, as if she too understood exactly how close they'd all come to losing everything in a single terrible hour, and exactly how much further they still had to fight before any of it would be safe. The sun came up gray and reluctant over a barn reduced to smoking bones, and Abigail stood in the yard with a horse blanket around her shoulders that Samuel had pressed on her sometime past 3 in the morning, watching embers wink out one by one in the ash. 20 horses, she said mostly to herself. Every one of them alive. Every one. Jesse sat on an overturned water trough nearby, his burned hands wrapped in strips of clean cloth Samuel had torn from his own shirt. His face streaked black with soot he hadn't bothered to wash off yet. "That's the only piece of last night worth holding on to." Samuel came around the corner of the ruined barn, with his cane sinking into ash-softened mud, his old face grim in a way that made Abigail's stomach clench before he'd said a single word. "Found where it started," he said. "Show me." He led them to the near corner, where the fire had first caught, and crouched with some difficulty to point at a section of scorched earth just outside the barn's foundation. "Coal oil," he said. "You can still smell it under the char. Poured along the base of the wall out here, where nobody sleeping inside would have smelled it till the flame was already climbing." "Deliberate," Jesse said. It wasn't a question. Deliberate and done by somebody who knew exactly where the horses were stalled and exactly how fast old dry wood catches. Samuel straightened, wincing, and looked at Abigail with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not just anger, but something closer to fear. "Whoever did this didn't care if you burned along with the barn, Mrs. Carter. That's not a warning. That's a man who stopped caring about consequences." Abigail felt the blanket slip from her shoulders and didn't bother to catch it. "Reed." "Can't prove it. Not yet." Samuel's voice was careful, the voice of a man who understood the difference between knowing a thing and being able to say it out loud in front of a judge. "But I'd wager my last dollar he didn't strike the match himself. Man like that hires his ugliness done at a distance." "Then we find who he hired." "Abigail." Jessie's voice quiet and urgent, cutting through her fury. "We nearly died in there last night. Both of us. You understand that if that beam had come down 2 seconds sooner—" "I understand it perfectly well, Mr. Calloway. I was there." She heard the sharpness in her own voice and didn't soften it, because softening it would have meant feeling the fear she'd been holding at bay since the barn roof collapsed. And she didn't have time to feel that fear. Not with 76 days left and a man somewhere in this county who'd rather burn her alive than watch her succeed. Which is precisely why we can't afford to wait and hope he doesn't try again. They rebuilt what shelter they could. That same day, a rough lean-to thrown up against the standing half of the old barn wall, enough to keep the horses out of weather while they figured out what came next. Word of the fire spread through town faster than the flames themselves had spread through the barn, and by afternoon, a small procession of wagons had begun arriving, unannounced neighbors Abigail barely knew. Carrying lumber nails, tools, food wrapped in cloth, none of them saying much beyond a nod and a "heard what happened" before setting to work. "Don't understand it," she admitted to Samuel, watching 2 of the Miller boys hauling planks toward the lean-to without being asked twice. 2 weeks ago, half this county thought I'd lost my mind. Now they're driving out here to help me rebuild." 2 weeks ago, they thought you were foolish," Samuel said. "Now they've watched a widow near burn alive, rather than abandon 20 animals nobody else wanted, and they've seen dry ground appear where a swamp sat for 30 years. Folks change their minds slower than they change their tune, Mrs. Carter, but they do change given enough proof." Fitch from the feed store arrived personally that afternoon, driving a wagon loaded with feed. He refused payment for standing awkward and hat in hands, in a way that reminded Abigail sharply of Nathan Reed's first visit to her parlor, though the resemblance ended entirely in what followed. "Heard it was set deliberate," Fitch said. "Coal oil. That's what Mr. Brooks believes. Man who'd do that to 20 horses, and the folks sleeping near them, ain't right in the head whoever he is." Fitch's jaw was tight. "I laughed at you in my own store, Mrs. Carter. Laughed along with every other fool in that room. I've been sick over it since I heard about the fire, thinking, what if you hadn't got out?" "You weren't the one who lit the match, Mr. Fitch." "No, but I helped make it easy for whoever did, laughing you into looking crazy, instead of standing up and saying what you were doing took more grit than any of us had." He set the feed down hard enough to make his point. "Whatever you need going forward, you send word to my store. I mean that plain." She thanked him and watched him go, and felt something shift in the ground beneath her. Not the literal ground, though, that too, but something in the shape of the town itself, tilting slowly away from mockery and toward a wary, hard-won respect. Reed came the following morning, and this time he didn't stay on his horse at the fence line. He rode straight into the yard, dismounted before anyone could stop him, and stood surveying the burned barn with an expression Abigail studied carefully for any flicker of guilt and found infuriatingly none. "Terrible thing," he said. "Heard about it in town. Came straight out to see if you needed anything." "Needed anything?" Abigail kept her voice level through sheer force of will. "You mean beyond the barn I lost the horses that nearly burned alive and the 2 people who nearly died pulling them out?" "I meant financially, Mrs. Carter. The bank could extend." "The bank could extend nothing. Mr. Reed and we both know it. 90 days was 90 days when you gave the notice, and I doubt very much the board's grown generous in the meantime." She held his eyes, watching for any crack in the composed surface. Strange, isn't it, that someone would set fire to my barn not 2 weeks before that deadline arrives? Almost as if someone wanted to make certain I couldn't possibly finish what I'd started. Something flickered, then quick, controlled, but real. Are you accusing me of something, Mrs. Carter? I'm observing a coincidence, Mr. Reed, nothing more. She let the silence stretch, let him sit with it. Though I understand coincidences have a way of unraveling given enough patience and the right questions asked to the right people. He mounted back up without further pleasantries, and this time he didn't bother with any parting reminder about the days remaining. He simply rode off faster than the visit warranted, and Jessie came to stand beside her watching the dust settle for the second time in 2 weeks. He's rattled, Jessie said. Good, a rattled man makes mistakes. Abigail turned back toward the drainage work, toward the 90 days, shrinking faster than she liked, toward the 20 horses that had survived fire and now needed to survive whatever Reed tried next. I intend to make certain he makes one. The drainage system's second major line cleared on the 16th day, and Samuel stood at the mouth of it with tears standing in his eyes for the second time in as many weeks, watching water find a path it hadn't traveled in 30 years. 2 lines running clean, he said. 4 more to go, but the chamber's holding steady, and the ground's drying faster than I dared hope. How much longer for the rest? 10 days if the weather holds and nothing else goes wrong. He gave her a careful look, which given the last 2 weeks, I'll admit feels like asking for a great deal. It was on the 18th day, with 72 remaining before the deadline, that the second true disaster struck. Not fire this time, but water, and worse for being entirely unexpected. Abigail woke to Samuel pounding on her door before dawn, his voice raw with an urgency that had her moving before she'd fully understood his words. 3rd line's failed, he said when she reached the yard. Collapsed sometime in the night, and it's pulled 2 others down with it. Whole section of cleared grounds flooding again fast. She followed him out to the bottomland, at a dead run, and found what she'd feared, water pooling, where dry earth had stood only a day before the careful work of 18 days, undone in a single night's collapse. The corn they'd already begun planting in the driest sections, now standing ankle-deep in returning swamp. How? She said, voice cracking. How does 30 years of holding steady collapse all at once exactly now? Samuel's face had gone gray. I don't believe it did collapse on its own, Mrs. Carter. Not this fast, not this complete. He knelt at the edge of the flooding, examining the broken earth with shaking hands. This has the same look as that main junction. Somebody's been down here in the dark breaking what we've spent 2 weeks clearing. Jessie, standing at her other side, went very still. Reed, or somebody working for him, Samuel said. Either way, this wasn't nature undoing itself. This was a man with a shovel and a grudge. Abigail stood in water that had no business being there, staring at ruin dressed up to look like bad luck, and felt something in her chest go past fury into a cold, clear place she hadn't visited before, a place where fear and grief burned away, and left only the hard determination to finish what she'd started, whatever it cost. Then we clear it again, she said. And this time, somebody stands watch every single night until this is finished. The watch fell to Jessie first, and to the gray gelding, the one saved from the fire, the weakest of the 20, the one everybody in town had called worthless from the very start. Something had changed in that horse since the barn burned around him. He'd grown watchful in a way none of the others had, ears pricked at every sound in the dark, and on the 3rd night of the new watch, it was the gelding who alerted them both. Jessie came pounding on Abigail's door well past midnight, breathless. Somebody's out in the bottomland. She was up and dressed and following him into the dark before her mind had caught up, and together they crept low along the fence line toward a shape moving careful and quiet near the main chamber. A man hooded against the cold, a shovel in his hands, working with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd done this exact damage before. "Stop right there!" Jessie called out, and the man, startled, spun and ran. They gave chase across ground still soft with recent flooding, and it was Jesse who caught him first, tackling him hard into the mud, wrestling the shovel from his hands as the man cursed and struggled beneath him. "Who sent you?" Jesse demanded, pinning him down. The hood had come loose in the struggle, and Abigail arrived breathless to find a face she half recognized. A hired hand she'd seen around the bank on occasion running errands for Reed. A young man named Coy Danvers, who looked considerably less confident with mud in his mouth and Jesse's knee in his back. "Nobody sent me," Coy gasped. "I don't know what You've got a shovel in your hand, and you were running from us in the middle of the night," Abigail said, kneeling in front of him, her voice gone flat and dangerous in a way that surprised even herself. "Who sent you, Mr. Danvers? And I'd think carefully before you answer, because Jesse here nearly died in a fire 2 weeks ago, that I don't believe started on its own either." Something in Coy's face crumpled at that. He was young, she realized, younger than she'd first thought, barely 20, and scared in a way that suggested he'd gotten in over his head with something far bigger than he'd understood when he'd agreed to it. "Mr. Reed," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper, "paid me to keep the drainage from working. Said if you failed to pay the note, the bank'd sell the land quick to the railroad, and there'd be a bonus in it for me for helping things along. And the fire. I don't know nothing about a fire, I swear it. I only ever did the drainage work breaking what you'd cleared. Never went near your barn." He was shaking now, whether from cold or fear, Abigail couldn't tell. "Please, ma'am. I got a mother in town, depends on what I bring home. I didn't mean no harm to you personal, I just needed the money." Abigail studied him a long moment, weighing fury against the plain fact that a scared boy with a mother to feed made a poor villain compared to the man who'd sent him. "Will you say that to a judge, Mr. Danvers? Everything you just told me?" His eyes widened. "Mr. Reed'll ruin me if I do. My mother, too. Mr. Reed's already trying to ruin me, and near got you and Mr. Calloway killed, doing it whether he lit that fire himself or not." She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered. "I can't promise you safety if you speak against him. But I can promise you this if you keep silent and let him go on doing this to whoever comes next after me. That silence will sit on your conscience a long time. Longer than any trouble telling the truth might bring you." Coy stared at her, mud-streaked and shaking, caught between fear and something that looked slowly like the first stirring of conscience. "I'll think on it," he said finally. "Think quick," Jesse said, hauling him to his feet. "We're running short on days, same as you're running short on excuses." They let Coy go that night, against Samuel's strong objection, and Abigail spent the following 2 days waiting to see whether that mercy had been wisdom or foolishness. It proved on the 20th day to be wisdom. Coy showed up at the ranch alone on foot, having walked the 4 miles from town, rather than risk being seen riding out. He looked like he hadn't slept, and he carried with him a leather satchel he clutched to his chest, like it might be the only thing standing between himself and disaster. "Found these in Mr. Reed's office," he said, hands shaking as he held the satchel out. "Copied what I could without him noticing. Letters between him and the railroad man Whitfield. Ledger pages showing payments made to men like me disguised as maintenance fees in the bank's books." He swallowed hard. "It's not everything, but it's enough to show he's been working with the railroad against you and your father, both going back near 2 years. Abigail took the satchel with hands that weren't quite steady herself. "Why bring this to me, Mr. Danvers? You could have burned it and walked away clean." "Because I keep thinking about what you said, about it sitting on my conscience." His young face had gone pale and resolute at once. "And because my mother told me once that a man who does wrong and stays quiet about it is worse than the man who told him to do it in the first place. I don't want to be that man, ma'am. Whatever it costs me." Samuel arrived in time to hear the last of it, and he took the satchel from Abigail with careful hands, already scanning the pages, with the sharp attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. "This is enough," he said slowly. "This is more than enough if we bring it before the county judge instead of trying to fight Reed alone. This shows conspiracy. Mrs. Carter fraud, deliberate sabotage, collusion with the railroad to strip you of land you're rightfully owed. A judge sees this, and it isn't your ranch in danger of foreclosure anymore. It's Reed's whole career, and likely his freedom besides. Abigail felt something like dizziness wash over her, relief and fury and disbelief all tangled together at once. Then we go to the judge, today. Careful, Samuel warned. Reed's not a man who'll go quiet once he understands what's been found. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. The ride into town that afternoon felt different from every previous ride Abigail had made, down that same road. Not the walk of a desperate widow, not even the cautious steps of a woman rebuilding what fire had taken, but something closer to a reckoning finally arrived. Judge Elias Farrow kept chambers above the county courthouse, a narrow room lined with law books that smelled of dust and pipe smoke, and he listened to Abigail's account with a stillness that gave away nothing until she'd finished and laid the satchel's contents across his desk. He read for a long while in silence. Samuel and Jesse, standing at Abigail's shoulders, Coy waiting nervous by the door, as if still expecting to be arrested himself for his part in it. "This is serious material, Mrs. Carter," Farrow said, finally removing his spectacles to rub at tired eyes. "If what's here holds up under examination, we're looking at land fraud conspiracy and destruction of property at minimum. Possibly attempted murder depending what more we learn about that fire." What happens now? Now I issue a summons for Nathan Reed to appear before this court, and I send word to the county sheriff to secure whatever additional evidence exists at the bank before anyone has opportunity to destroy it. Farrow's face had gone hard, in a way that suggested he took considerable personal offense at bankers who abused their position. "And I suspend the foreclosure proceedings against Carter Ranch effective immediately pending full investigation of these claims." Abigail felt her knees nearly give beneath her, relief crashing through her so suddenly she had to grip the edge of the judge's desk to stay upright. Jesse's hand found the small of her back, steadying her without a word, and she let herself lean into it just for a moment before straightening again. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Carter. Men like Reed don't go down easy, and men like Whitfield have railroad money behind them that buys a great deal of legal delay. This fight isn't finished simply because we've started it." Farrow slid his spectacles back on. "But you've given this court more than enough to begin, and that's no small thing." Oh, Reed didn't come quietly. Word reached the ranch 2 days later, carried by Fitch, riding hard from town, that Reed had gotten wind of the summons before the sheriff arrived and had barricaded himself in the bank with a rifle, shouting through the door that he'd burn every ledger in the building before he let anyone see what was inside. "He's cornered," Fitch said, breathless from the ride. "Sheriff's got the building surrounded, but Reed's threatening to torch the place. Whole town's worried he'll bring half of Main Street down with it if that fire catches." Abigail felt cold dread pool in her stomach. "The satchel Coy brought us, that's copies not originals. If the real ledgers burn, then whatever he's hidden burns with them, and we're left arguing conspiracy on second-hand paper a good lawyer could pick apart in an afternoon." Samuel finished grimly. Jesse was already moving toward the horses. "Then we make sure that fire doesn't happen." They rode into town at a pace that left the horses lathered, arriving to find exactly the scene Fitch had described, Reed's bank surrounded by half the sheriff's deputies, and a growing crowd of onlookers, Reed himself visible through a front window with a rifle across his knees and a can of coal oil sitting conspicuous on the counter beside him. "Stay back," the sheriff warned as Abigail approached. "Man's desperate and desperate men do foolish things." "I know exactly how desperate he is, Sheriff. I've spent 3 weeks living with what his desperation's already cost me." She stepped forward anyway, ignoring the sheriff's protest, until she stood close enough to the window that Reed could see her clearly through the glass. "Mr. Reed," she called. "It's Abigail Carter." His face visible through the window twisted with something between hatred and panic. "Come to watch me hang Mrs. Carter. Come to gloat. I've come to ask you a question, and I'd like an honest answer for once in this whole miserable business." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she felt it in her throat. "Did you order that fire set at my barn? The one that nearly killed me and Mr. Calloway both?" Silence long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "No," he said finally. voice cracking through the window glass. "That wasn't me. I swear it wasn't me, Mrs. Carter. I wanted your land. God forgive me. Wanted it bad enough to break drainage lines and pay off a boy to sabotage your work. But I never ordered fire set with people sleeping near it. That's not—" His voice broke entirely. "That's not who I meant to become." "Then who?" "Whitfield." The name came out bitter, defeated. "Railroad wanted this finished faster than I could manage through the bank alone. Sent word 2 weeks back that if I couldn't force you off the land through foreclosure, he'd see it done another way. I didn't know what he meant by that till I heard about your barn burning, and by then it was already done, and I was in too deep to do anything but keep going the way I'd started." Abigail felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not anything close to it, but a kind of clarity that let her see the whole shape of the thing at once. Reed wasn't the true villain of this story. He was simply the first domino, weak and greedy, and finally cornered by consequences he'd helped set in motion but never fully controlled. "Put down the rifle, Mr. Reed," she said. "Put it down and tell the judge everything you just told me about Whitfield, about the railroad's plans, about every ledger you've falsified, trying to strip land out from under people who trusted this bank with their futures. Do that, and I'll stand in that courtroom myself and tell the judge you cooperated. That has to count for something even now." The silence stretched so long Abigail thought she'd failed. Thought the whole standoff might end in fire and blood after all, and then slowly the rifle lowered, and Reed's shoulders sagged in visible surrender. "I'm tired," he said so quiet she barely heard it through the glass. "God help me. I'm so tired of being the man who does this kind of harm for other men's profit." He set the rifle onto the counter, stepped back from the window, and the sheriff's deputies moved in, careful and fast, taking him, without further struggle. As they led him out past her in irons, he paused, meeting Abigail's eyes, with an expression stripped of all its former arrogance. "I am sorry," he said, "for whatever that's worth to you now." "It's worth something," she said honestly. "It's worth a man finally telling the truth after 2 years of lies." "That's not nothing, Mr. Reed, but it doesn't undo what's been done either." He nodded, accepting that, and let the deputies lead him away toward the jail, and Abigail stood in the street watching him go with a strange hollow feeling, where triumph should have lived. Relief, yes, and vindication, but also a tired sorrow for a man who'd let greed and fear turn him into someone he himself no longer recognized. The name Silas Whitfield meant nothing to the county sheriff, nothing to Judge Farrow, until Samuel, working through the ledgers Coy had copied, cross-referencing every date and signature with the patient thoroughness of a man who'd spent his whole working life reading fine print, found the thread that mattered most. "Whitfield's not just a land agent," he told Abigail, spreading the papers across her kitchen table 3 days after Reed's arrest, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "He's been doing this same scheme up and down this territory for 6 years. Different banks, different bankers, same pattern: sabotage the drainage or the irrigation or whatever keeps the land productive, force foreclosure, buy cheap once the owner's broken. Your father's ranch wasn't the first, Mrs. Carter. It was maybe the 9th or 10th. How many families? Can't say for certain yet, but enough that if this comes fully to light, it won't just save Carter Ranch. It'll expose a fraud that's been quietly ruining families across half this territory for the better part of a decade." Abigail sat with that weight settling over her, the understanding that her father's death, her own, near ruined the fire that had nearly killed her and Jesse both, was not some isolated cruelty visited on her alone, but one thread in a pattern of calculated greed, stretching back years and touching families she'd never even met. "Then we don't stop with Reed," she said slowly. "We follow this all the way to Whitfield and past him if there's someone higher still pulling those strings." Jesse, sitting across the table with his bandaged hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, gone cold, looked up at her with something like pride mixed into the exhaustion on his face. "That's a bigger fight than the one you started 3 weeks ago. It's the same fight, Mr. Calloway, just bigger than I understood it to be when it started." She looked around the table at Samuel's tired determination, at Jesse's steady support, at the ledgers that held the proof of years of quiet cruelty finally coming into the light. My father wrote that the land wasn't dead, that the water simply forgot where to go. I think about that a great deal these days, and I think he might have meant more than just the drainage, though I don't suppose he knew it himself. What do you mean? I mean, there's a great deal in this county that's been forgotten or buried or deliberately hidden. Not just water underground, but truth under lies, and kindness under greed and worth, under other folks' careless judgment about what's too broken to matter. She looked down at the stack of papers at evidence of fraud that would take weeks yet to fully untangle, and felt something settle into place inside her, solid and certain as brick beneath 30 years of mud. I intend to keep digging until every bit of it's brought back into the light, whatever that costs, and however long it takes. Outside, past the kitchen window, the bottomland stretched dark and quiet under the evening sky. 6 drainage lines nearly cleared corn beginning to push green shoots through soil that had drowned for 30 years. 20 horses grazing peaceful in pasture that had once been nothing but useless swamp. And somewhere in that darkness, Abigail knew the fight was far from finished. But for the first time since her father's heart had given out in the East Field on a Tuesday morning in September, she felt something that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the stubborn, hard-won conviction that the ground beneath her, literal and otherwise, had finally begun to hold. The corn went into the ground on the 24th day, and Abigail knelt in soil that still smelled faintly of 30 years drowning, pressing seed into earth with her own hands alongside Jesse Samuel and 4 of the Miller boys who'd shown up unasked with sacks of seed corn slung over their shoulders. Late planting, Samuel warned, watching her work. Later than any sensible farmer would risk this far into summer. I know it. Frost could take it before it's ready if autumn comes early. I know that too, Mr. Brooks. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of one dirt-streaked hand. But I've got soil that's waited 30 years to grow something, and I don't intend to make it wait 1 season longer simply because the calendar's inconvenient. He almost smiled at that, the closest thing to real amusement she'd seen cross his weathered face in weeks. Your grandfather would have said the same thing, I expect. Stubborn men the Carters. Stubborn women too, apparently. Jesse worked a row over moving with the careful economy of a man whose burned hands still pained him more than he'd admit, and Abigail caught herself watching him more than she watched her own, planting the set of his jaw when a twinge of pain crossed his face the way he pushed through it. Anyway, without complaint. The particular gentleness he showed toward the horses even now. 3 weeks passed, the fire still checking the gray gelding's legs each morning, like a man reassuring himself the animal had truly survived. You're staring, he said without looking up. I'm supervising. Didn't know supervising required quite so much staring, Miss Carter. He glanced sideways, something warm and teasing in his eyes, despite the exhaustion underneath. Or is it something else you're doing? She felt heat climb into her face and busied herself with the next row of seed, refusing to answer, and behind her she heard Samuel's low chuckle entirely too, knowing for her comfort. Word came from Judge Farrow's office on the 27th day, carried by a rider sent special, and Abigail's stomach dropped the moment she saw the boy's grave expression before he'd even dismounted. Judge says you're needed in town, the boy said. Says it's urgent. Something about the railroad man. She rode in within the hour, Jesse and Samuel flanking her, and found Farrow's chambers considerably more crowded than her last visit. A stranger in a fine gray suit standing near the window. A lawyer by his bearing, and beside him, a man Abigail recognized instantly from the signature on those stolen documents. Silas Whitfield was younger than she'd expected, smooth-faced and confident in a way that made her skin crawl the moment his eyes settled on her. Mrs. Carter. Farrow said, his voice carrying a warning she understood instantly. This is Mr. Whitfield representing the Montana Northern Railway and his attorney, Mr. Pierce. They've come to discuss the matter of your land. There's nothing to discuss, Abigail said. Mr. Reed's already confessed to the sabotage. Your own agent's signature sits on documents proving 2 years of coordinated fraud against my family. Whitfield's smile didn't waver. Mrs. Carter, I understand you've had a difficult few weeks and I sympathize entirely. But I think there's been a misunderstanding about the railroad's involvement in whatever local disputes you've had with your banker. A misunderstanding. She let the words sit in the air, cold and disbelieving. Mr. Whitfield, I have letters bearing your signature discussing the timeline for my father's foreclosure 2 years before it happened. I have ledger entries showing payments authorized by your office for the sabotage of drainage systems on land you intended to purchase. Which part of that would you like to characterize as misunderstanding? Pierce the lawyer stepped forward smoothly. Those documents you're referencing were obtained illegally. Mrs. Carter stolen from a bank's private records by an employee who's since fled the county rather than face charges himself for theft. Whatever they purport to show, they'll never survive scrutiny in a proper court. Coy Danvers hasn't fled anywhere, Mr. Pierce. He's staying with Mr. Brooks here, willing and ready to testify to exactly what he did and who paid him to do it. Abigail kept her voice level, though her pulse hammered. And Mr. Reed's already confessed the whole arrangement to Judge Farrow directly. I don't believe stolen paper's the weakness in this case you're hoping it is. Farrow cleared his throat. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pierce, the court has sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges against your company's conduct in this matter, regardless of how those documents were initially obtained. I'd suggest you consider your position carefully before this goes further. Whitfield's composure finally cracked just slightly, a flash of something colder and more dangerous showing through the smooth exterior. The railroad has considerable resources, Your Honor. Considerably more than a small county court, and considerably more than one widow's ranch. I'd think carefully myself about how far you intend to push this. The threat hung naked in the room, and Abigail felt fury rise up hot and clean through her fear. Is that meant to frighten me, Mr. Whitfield, because I've already survived a fire meant to kill me? Sabotage meant to ruin me, and a banker willing to break the law on your company's behalf. I don't imagine your resources frighten me half so much as you'd like. Careful, Mrs. Carter, Whitfield said softly. Brave words don't always age well. He left with Pierce trailing behind him, and the chamber sat in tense silence until the door closed fully behind them. That man just threatened you, Jesse said, voice tight with barely controlled anger, in front of a judge and walked out like he owns this whole territory. He believes he does, Farrow said grimly. And I won't pretend his resources aren't a genuine concern, Mrs. Carter. Railroad money buys delay, buys expensive lawyers, sometimes buys judges in counties less careful than this one. This fight isn't finished simply because Reed's confessed. I understand that, Your Honor. Do you? Farrow's eyes were sharp, not unkind but serious. Because from here forward, this isn't a fight against one greedy banker anymore. It's a fight against a company with more money than this entire county sees in a decade, and men like Whitfield don't simply walk away when they lose one battle. They regroup, and they come back harder. The harder came 3 days later, and it came in a form Abigail hadn't anticipated. She was in the bottomland checking the 4th drainage line's progress when Fitch came riding out at a gallop, face grim with news he clearly didn't relish delivering. Banks changed hands, he said, still catching his breath. Whitfield's company bought out the note on Carter Ranch direct from the regional bank board this morning, paid the whole outstanding balance in cash, took over the debt entire. Abigail felt the ground tilt beneath her for the second time that month. They can't do that. Judge Farrow suspended the foreclosure proceeding under Reed's authority. Yes, but the debt itself's still real. Mrs. Carter, whatever numbers were legitimate before Reed's fraud got layered on top. Whitfield's lawyers are arguing the underlying note remains valid and collectible by whoever now holds it regardless of who committed fraud around the edges of it. Fitch's face was grim. They're saying you still owe the original debt, and now Whitfield's company holds the note instead of the bank. That's absurd. That's the very definition of profiting from their own crime. Might be, but Pierce is arguing it in front of Judge Farrow as we speak, and from what I hear it's not so easy a thing to untangle as it ought to be. Fitch shifted uncomfortable in his saddle. Wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it secondhand in town, and it hit you twice as hard. Samuel, arriving in time to catch the last of it, went very still. They're trying to buy the debt clean of the fraud attached to it. Clever in a filthy sort of way. If it works, they get the land they've wanted all along, and Reed takes the whole blame alone, while Whitfield's company walks away untouched, simply having purchased a legitimate debt from a corrupt banker. Can they do that? Abigail asked, voice tight. Legally, I don't rightly know. That's a question for lawyers smarter than me, and we don't have the money to hire one half so sharp as whatever Whitfield's paying. Samuel's old face had gone lined with worry in a way that frightened her more than his words did. This is the fight Pharaoh warned you about, Mrs. Carter, and I fear we're not equipped for it. That night, sitting on the porch with the lamp burned low, and 63 days shrinking towards something that felt once again dangerously insufficient, Abigail let herself feel briefly the full weight of everything stacked against her. I keep thinking we've won, she admitted to Jesse, who sat beside her in the dark, close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against hers. Every time I think it's something new rises up to prove me wrong. That's not losing, Abigail. That's just how a long fight goes. His voice was quiet, steady, the same steadiness she'd leaned on since that first morning outside the feed store. You've beaten Reed already. You've got Coy's testimony. You've got a judge on your side. You've got drainage lines running clean for the first time in 30 years. Whitfield buying the debt is a filthy trick, but it's not the same as him having already won. Feels like it tonight. I know it does. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rougher, more careful, the way it did when he was working towards something he hadn't quite found words for yet. Can I tell you something? Something I haven't said this whole 3 weeks. You can tell me anything, Jesse. I came to this county 2 years back with nothing but a horse and a grudge against every bank that ever took land from people who deserved better. Been drifting since rescuing animals. Nobody wanted telling myself that was purpose enough for a man with nothing left to build toward. He turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight she could see something raw and unguarded in his expression that she'd never quite seen from him before. Then I heard a woman standing in a feed store, daring the whole town to laugh at her, and something in me sat up and paid attention for the first time in longer than I care to admit. Jesse, let me finish, please. I've been working up to this longer than you know. He took her hand, careful of his own bandaged palm, and held it like something precious. I don't know how this fight ends. Might be we win it clean, might be Whitfield's money crushes us both flat before it's through. But whatever happens, Abigail Carter, I want you to know, I'm not standing beside you because of some debt I owe my sister's memory, or because I felt sorry for a grieving widow that first morning. I'm standing beside you because somewhere in these 3 weeks, digging in mud and pulling horses from fire and fighting a fight that was never mine to begin with, I fell in love with you. Plain and simple, and more than I know what to do with. Abigail sat very still, her heart hammering hard enough. She thought he must surely hear it. 3 weeks of grief and fury and grinding determination suddenly cracking open around something she hadn't let herself name not once, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts. I've been afraid to say that, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Afraid if I let myself feel anything besides fighting for this land, I wouldn't have strength left for the fight itself. And now I think maybe I had it backward. Maybe you're not something pulling strength away from the fight, Jesse Calloway. Maybe you're part of why I've had strength enough to keep fighting at all. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together properly, and felt something settle deep in her chest, solid as brick beneath 30 years of mud. I love you too. I believe I have for longer than I've let myself admit. He kissed her, then gentle and unhurried, despite the urgency of everything pressing in around them. And for one suspended moment, the foreclosure and Whitfield's money, and 63 shrinking days, all fell away entirely, leaving only the two of them on a porch in the dark, finally saying aloud what 3 weeks of shared struggle had already built between them, brick by careful brick. Pharaoh's ruling came 4 days later, and it split the difference in a way that satisfied no one fully, but gave Abigail something to fight with. The court finds, Pharaoh read from his bench voice, formal and careful, that the original debt against Carter Ranch, absent the fraudulent fees and penalties added by Nathan Reed, stands at considerably less than the amount claimed by the Montana Northern Railway. Furthermore, the court finds that the railway's purchase of this note, made with full knowledge of ongoing fraud investigation, constitutes purchase in bad faith, and therefore the debt collectible by the railway is limited strictly to the original legitimate balance, approximately 1/4 of the amount Mr. Reed originally claimed. Pierce was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, that ruling has no precedent. It has precedent in basic equity, Mr. Pierce, which this court is entitled to apply where fraud has clearly occurred. Farrow's voice brooked no argument. Mrs. Carter, you have 60 days from today to satisfy the legitimate balance of $840, or the note becomes collectible in full. I'd suggest you use the time wisely. $840. It was still a fortune to a ranch that had spent nearly everything on 20 broken horses and drainage repairs. But it was a fortune she could conceivably reach where the original inflated debt had been an impossibility dressed up as a number. We can do this, she told Jesse and Samuel outside the courthouse, disbelief and hope tangling together in her chest. If the corn comes in even half as strong as you're hoping, Mr. Brooks, we can actually do this. Weather willing, Samuel cautioned, though even he couldn't hide the cautious hope in his own voice. And assuming Whitfield doesn't find some other filthy trick to try before harvest. He wasn't wrong to worry. Whitfield tried exactly that twice more before the corn ripened once through a legal challenge to Farrow's ruling that ate up 2 precious weeks before being denied on appeal. Once through an attempt to buy up water rights further upstream that would have starved the very creek Abigail's grandfather's drainage system emptied into an attempt only caught and blocked because Samuel, reading legal notices with the same obsessive thoroughness he'd applied to the ledgers, spotted the filing 3 days before. It would have gone through unchallenged. He's relentless, Abigail said, exhausted, after the water rights fight had finally been settled in her favor. Every time we close one door, he finds another. Man's used to getting what he wants, Jesse said. Doesn't know how to lose gracefully because he's never had to learn the skill. Then we'll have to teach him. The town's transformation, meanwhile, continued in ways that still occasionally caught Abigail by surprise. The same feed store that had erupted in laughter that first morning now served as an informal gathering place for anyone wanting news of the Carter Ranch fight, Fitch himself becoming something of an unofficial ally, passing along whispers he heard from bank customers about Whitfield's next moves. The banker's wife, Mrs. Delacroix, whose husband ran the only competing bank in the county, arrived unannounced one afternoon with an offer that left Abigail momentarily speechless. A low-interest loan, if needed, to help cover the settlement should the corn fail to yield enough. "Why would you help me?" Abigail asked, genuinely bewildered. "You don't know me, Mrs. Delacroix. I know a woman who stood up to fraud and fire both, and I know my husband's been ashamed for years that our own bank's never done anything half so brave in the face of what men like Reed and Whitfield do to families in this territory." Mrs. Delacroix's eyes were kind but firm. "Consider it an investment, Mrs. Carter, in the kind of banking I'd like to see more of in this county. The kind that doesn't sell out desperate families to railroad money." Abigail thanked her, moved nearly to tears by the offer, even as she hoped she wouldn't need to take it, and watched the woman ride off with a growing sense that the fight she'd started alone in a feed store had somehow become bigger than herself. Bigger than one ranch, touching corners of the county she'd never expected to reach. The corn began to tassel in the final week of August, and Samuel walked the rows each morning with an expression of quiet, disbelieving wonder that Abigail found herself sharing more each day. "Never seen growth like this," he admitted, running a hand along a stalk taller than his own head. 30 years of trapped nutrients released all at once into soil that's finally breathing right. "This is the finest corn I've seen in this county in my whole life. Mrs. Carter and I include every season before the drought in that reckoning. Enough to cover the settlement. More than enough if the weather holds through harvest." He looked at her, something like pride, mixing with the wonder in his weathered face. "Your father was right all those years ago, writing that one unfinished sentence in his notebook. The water simply forgot where to go. Once it remembered, this land remembered right along with it." The harvest itself, when it came in mid-September, drew half the county out to help, not from obligation, not from pity, but from genuine wonder at watching 100 acres of former swampland yield corn taller and thicker than any other farm in the drought-stricken valley. Neighbors who'd laughed that first morning worked alongside Abigail from dawn past dusk, and by the third day of harvest, the barn Jesse had rebuilt with borrowed lumber and neighborly labor stood filled with more grain than Carter Ranch had produced in the 5 years before the drought began. Whitfield showed up on the final day unannounced, standing at the fence line watching the harvest with an expression that had finally entirely lost its earlier confidence. "Come to see the impossible for yourself, Mr. Whitfield," Abigail called out, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. "Come to offer you a settlement," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "The railroad's prepared to forgive the entire remaining debt drop, all claims to this land permanently, in exchange for you signing an agreement never to pursue further legal action against the company regarding Reed's conduct or my own. You're offering to walk away clean. I'm offering you your ranch free and clear, Mrs. Carter. Isn't that what you wanted from the very beginning?" Abigail set down the sack of corn she'd been carrying and walked to the fence, studying him with a clarity that had taken 3 months of fire and fraud and grinding determination to earn. "What I wanted, Mr. Whitfield, was for my father's land to live again. I've gotten that no thanks to you or your railroad. What I want now is for every family your company's ruined across this territory to have the same chance I did to fight back and win. I don't believe I can get that by signing away my right to speak about what you and Reed did here. You'd rather drag this out in court for years, risking everything you've built over some principle about families you've never met. I'd rather do what's right, Mr. Whitfield, even when it costs me something. I've had considerable practice at that particular skill these past 3 months." She held his gaze steady. "I'll pay the legitimate debt Judge Farrow set in full from this harvest. But I won't sign away Coy Danvers's testimony, or Mr. Reed's confession, or my own right to see this fraud exposed fully in open court. If your company's done this to other families, they deserve to know it and deserve the same chance to fight that I had." Whitfield's jaw tightened, and for a moment Abigail thought he might argue further, might threaten again the way he had in Farrow's chambers weeks before. Instead, something in him seemed to deflate the fight going out of him all at once. "You understand, this means the railroad's legal exposure across the whole territory," he said quietly. "Every parcel we've touched, every family we've squeezed. It could unravel years of careful work. I understand it means justice for people who never got the chance I had, Mr. Whitfield. That's not a burden I intend to carry guilt over." He left without further argument, and Abigail watched him ride away for what she suspected would be the last time feeling something settle fully into place inside her. Not triumph exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but something steadier and more permanent. The particular satisfaction of having done a hard thing rightly instead of simply easily. The payment went to the county clerk's office 3 weeks later, $840 counted out in careful stacks from the harvest's proceeds. And Judge Farrow himself signed the document declaring Carter Ranch's debt satisfied in full, the foreclosure permanently canceled. Abigail stood in the courthouse with Jesse's hand in hers, Samuel beaming beside them, and felt 3 months of grief and fury and grinding hope finally settle into something she could only call peace. "It's done," she said, disbelieving even as she said it. "It's actually done." "It's done," Farrow confirmed, sliding the signed document across his desk toward her. "Carter Ranch belongs to you free and clear, Mrs. Carter, with the court's compliments on a fight well fought." Outside the courthouse, half the town had gathered to hear the news, and when Abigail stepped out into the September sunlight with the document clutched in her hands, a cheer went up that startled her nearly to tears. Fitch and the Miller boys, and Mrs. Delacroix and a dozen others, who'd once laughed at a grieving widow's foolishness, now celebrating the very stubbornness they'd mocked. "Speech, Mrs. Carter," someone called, and Abigail laughed, wiping at her eyes before finding words she hadn't planned, but that came anyway, true and simple. "3 months ago I stood in a feed store and asked for 20 horses nobody else wanted," she said, her voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. "You all laughed, and I understood why, because I'd have laughed too in your place. But those 20 horses found what 30 years of grief had buried, not just drainage under mud, but proof that nothing's ever quite so worthless as the world decides it is, if somebody's willing to look close enough to see the truth of it. She looked around at faces that had transformed from mockery to something like reverence over 3 hard months. This land's alive again because a blind old mare walked where nobody else thought to look. I hope that means something to every one of you, same as it's meant everything to me. The crowd's cheer redoubled, and beside her Jesse squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with something that looked very much like pride mixed with love, and Abigail understood, standing there in the September sun, with her father's ranch finally permanently safe, that she had built something in these 3 months that would outlast even the harvest itself. Not just a restored ranch, but a town remade by watching one stubborn woman refuse to accept that anything or anyone was beyond redemption. The cheering hadn't fully faded from the courthouse steps before the letters started arriving. They came slow at first, 1 or 2 a week, then a steady trickle that Abigail found waiting in her mailbox each time she rode into town. Letters from families up and down the territory who'd read newspaper accounts of the Carter Ranch fight and recognized with sick and sudden clarity their own ruin in the pattern Samuel had uncovered. A widow near Bozeman, whose irrigation had failed mysteriously 2 years running before the bank called her note. A father of 6 outside Helena, whose well had gone bad the same season Whitfield's company began buying up parcels along the river. A young couple near the Wyoming line who'd lost their homestead entirely. The land sold within the month to a buyer connected it, turned out to the very same railroad. There's more of them than I feared, Samuel admitted one evening, sitting at Abigail's kitchen table, with a growing stack of correspondence spread before him like a map of quiet cruelty. Near 24 families by my count going back 6 years. Whitfield's scheme ran considerably wider than just this valley. What do we do with 24 letters, Mr. Brooks? We do what you did from the start, Mrs. Carter. We dig until we find the proof, and then we take it to a judge willing to hear it. He looked up at her, something fierce and hopeful in his old eyes, despite the weariness in his voice. You've already shown it's possible to win against them. That's worth more to these families than you might understand. Hope's a rarer thing than money out here, and you've given a good many people their first taste of it in years. Jesse, standing at the stove where he'd taken to helping with supper most evenings, now without either of them quite deciding when that had become a habit, glanced over with a small proud smile. Sounds like Carter Ranch is fixing to become something bigger than a ranch. I never asked for that, Abigail said, though she felt the truth of it settling into her chest all the same, a weight she found herself willing to carry. No, Samuel agreed. But it's found you regardless, same as those horses did. Some things happen that way whether we ask for them or not. The formal investigation into Whitfield and the Montana Northern Railway opened in October, driven by Judge Farrow's own insistence and bolstered considerably by Coy Danvers, who'd overcome his fear enough to testify not only about his own role in sabotaging the Carter drainage, but about conversations he'd overheard between Reed and Whitfield's agents discussing at least 4 other properties targeted by the same scheme. Reed himself, awaiting trial in the county jail, proved an unexpectedly useful witness once the fight had gone out of him entirely. Abigail visited him twice that autumn, a decision Jesse questioned and Samuel outright discouraged, but one she felt compelled toward, regardless some stubborn conviction that a man who'd finally chosen honesty over further lies deserved to be heard rather than simply punished. You didn't have to come, Reed said the second visit, sitting across from her in the narrow visiting room with iron bars between them and a guard stationed close enough to hear every word. I didn't, she agreed. I came because I want to understand something, Mr. Reed. You were a respected man in this county once. What made you willing to destroy a grieving widow's inheritance for railroad money? He was quiet a long while, and when he finally answered, his voice had none of its former smooth confidence. Fear, mostly. Whitfield's company held paper on debts of my own bad investments I'd made years back before I took the bank position. He made it clear, quiet and careful, that those debts could be called due all at once, ruining me entire, unless I cooperated with what he wanted done to certain properties. He looked up at her, something like genuine shame crossing his face. I told myself it was just business at first. Numbers on a page, nothing personal. Easier to believe that than to admit what I was actually doing to real people. And when it stopped being numbers on a page, when it became my father dying worn down by debt that never should have existed, by then I was in too deep to see a way out that didn't end with my own ruin. His hands folded on the table between them trembled slightly. That's not an excuse, Mrs. Carter. I know it's not. I just want you to understand it wasn't hatred that drove me to it. It was cowardice dressed up as necessity, same as it always is with men like me. Abigail studied him a long moment, weighing the fury she still carried against the plain, exhausted honesty in his face. Testify fully against Whitfield, she said finally. Everything you know, every family he's touched, every scheme going back as far as your memory reaches. Do that, and I'll speak on your behalf when sentencing comes, same as I promised outside the bank that day. Why would you do that for me after everything? Because I've learned something these past months, Mr. Reed, that I didn't fully understand before. Nearly everyone's capable of doing wrong when fear or greed pushes hard enough. What matters in the end is whether a person finds their way back to truth once they've strayed from it. You found yours, however late, however forced. That deserves to count for something even set against everything it cost. He wept then, quiet and unguarded, and Abigail left the jail feeling not triumph, but something more complicated. A tired, hard-won grace that surprised her with how much lighter it left her than anger ever had. The trial against Whitfield and the Montana Northern Railway opened in November, drawing attention from newspapers as far as Helena and Cheyenne curious readers hungry for the story of a widow's ranch that had somehow unraveled a railroad conspiracy stretching across half the territory. Abigail testified first, walking the courtroom through every detail from that first morning in the feed store, to the fire that nearly killed her, to the drainage lines, sabotaged in darkness, to Whitfield's threats, delivered smooth and cold in Pharaoh's own chambers. Coy Danvers followed, nervous but resolute, laying out names and dates and payments with a thoroughness that visibly rattled Pierce's careful legal strategy. Reed came last among the key witnesses, and his testimony, detailed, unflinching, offered without the self-serving hedges Pierce had clearly hoped for, proved the most damaging of all, connecting Whitfield directly to schemes across 6 years and 24 families. Whitfield's own defense crumbled steadily across 11 days of testimony, Pierce's objections growing more desperate as evidence mounted that even railroad money couldn't fully bury. The verdict, when it came, brought a satisfaction Abigail hadn't quite let herself anticipate. Whitfield was found guilty on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to arson, the last charge finally proven when a hired man tracked down through Coy's testimony confessed under questioning that Whitfield's office had indeed ordered the barn fire over Reed's explicit objection to accelerate a timeline the railroad had grown impatient waiting on. 20 years. Pharaoh announced, reading the sentence in a courtroom gone utterly silent. The maximum this court's authority allows for crimes of this scope and cruelty. Whitfield's composure finally broke entirely as the deputies led him away. His earlier confidence replaced by something raw and frightened, and Abigail watched him go without triumph, only a tired relief that justice, however imperfect and however long delayed, had finally arrived for families who'd waited years to see it. Reed's own sentencing came separately, softened considerably by his cooperation and by Abigail's promised testimony on his behalf. 5 years with possibility of reduction for continued cooperation in the broader investigation, a fraction of what Whitfield received, and Reed accepted it with something like grim gratitude, thanking Abigail quietly as he too was led away. The Montana Northern Railway itself, facing mounting legal exposure across the territory, settled with the 24 affected families within the month. Restitution payments canceled debts and, in several cases, outright return of land that had been seized under fraudulent circumstances. It wasn't perfect justice. Some families had already lost too much to fully recover homes sold and scattered, and years of grief that no settlement could undo. But it was more than any of them had believed possible 3 months earlier, and Abigail felt, watching letter after grateful letter arrive at her ranch through that winter, that her father's unfinished sentence had proven true in ways he could never have imagined when he'd written it. The water had found its way, and in finding it, it had carried a great deal more than mud downstream. Winter settled over Carter Ranch with a gentleness that felt after the fire and fraud and grinding fight of autumn, almost unearned. The corn harvest had left the barn's loft heavy with grain, more than enough to see the ranch through to spring, with surplus besides, and the 20 horses no longer 20 in fact, but 23. 3 more rescued through the fall from a rancher near the Wyoming line who'd heard Abigail's story and reached out asking if she might take animals his own. Hard luck could no longer feed grazed fat and content across pasture that bore no trace anymore of the swamp it had been. Bess, blind and gentle and utterly unbothered by her own fame, had become something of a local legend, and more than one traveler passing through Silver Creek that winter asked specifically to see the horse who'd found buried gold beneath a ruined field. A story that had grown considerably in the retelling, but carried at its core a truth Abigail never tired of confirming. She didn't find gold. Abigail would tell them standing at the fence with her hand resting on the old mare's neck. She found something better. She found proof that nothing's as worthless as the world decides if somebody bothers to look close enough. It was on a cold, clear evening in late November snow, just beginning to dust the pasture fence, that Jessie asked her the question she'd half expected for weeks, and still felt entirely unprepared for when it finally came. They were sitting on the rebuilt porch, the new barn standing solid and proud behind them, where the burned one had once stood, and Jessie had gone quiet in a way that made Abigail glance over curious, just in time to see him drop to one knee in the snow-dusted dirt before her. "Abigail Carter," he said, his voice steadier than his shaking hands. "I've spent 2 years drifting this territory telling myself I was just a man who rescued horses nobody else wanted. Then I met a woman doing the exact same thing, only braver, and I understood finally what all that drifting had actually been leading me toward." He opened his palm, revealing a simple gold band, plain and unadorned, clearly not new, but polished with obvious care. "This was my mother's ring. Only thing I've got left of my folks besides memory and stubbornness. I'd be honored beyond anything I know how to say if you'd wear it and let me stand beside you, not just through fights like the one we've already won, but through whatever comes next for however long we're given." Abigail felt tears rise before she'd fully processed the words. 3 months of grief and fury and grinding determination cracking open around something purely simply joyful for the first time since her father's death. "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished rising, pulling him up and into her arms with a fierceness that startled them both. "Yes, Jessie Calloway, 1,000 times yes." He laughed, disbelieving and overjoyed, and slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled more from happiness now than from any residual pain of old burns. And they stood together on the porch in the gathering snow. 23 horses grazing peaceful behind them. A ranch saved, and a town transformed, and a fraud exposed. All wrapped up somehow in this one, small, perfect moment neither of them had dared fully hope for 3 months earlier. They married in the spring in a ceremony that drew half the county out to Carter Ranch on a warm May afternoon. The same feed store crowd that had once laughed at Abigail's foolishness now gathered to celebrate what that foolishness had become. Fitch gave away the bride a role Abigail had asked him to fill with a gratitude that left the older man visibly moved, explaining simply that he'd been the first in town to truly change his mind about her, and she wanted him standing beside her when she made the biggest change of all. Samuel served as best man, standing beside Jessie with obvious pride, the old engineer having become something closer to family than either of them had quite planned across the months of shared struggle. Mrs. Delacroix organized the reception with a generosity that spoke to genuine friendship rather than mere neighborly obligation, and even Coy Danvers attended, standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, until Abigail pulled him forward personally, insisting he belonged among the guests who'd helped save this land every bit as much as anyone else present. "Couldn't have done it without your courage, Mr. Danvers," she told him, and watched the young man's face flush with a pride he clearly hadn't expected to feel on this particular day. "You could have stayed silent and kept yourself safe. You chose truth instead, at real cost to yourself. That's no small thing. The vows themselves were simple, exchanged beneath an arch Jesse had built from wood, salvaged from the very barn that had once nearly claimed both their lives, a detail Abigail had specifically requested. Wanting the worst night of their shared history, transformed quite literally into the foundation for their happiest. I promise to dig alongside you, Jesse said when his turn came, voice thick with emotion. He made no effort to hide, through mud and fire, and whatever fights still lie ahead, same as I have from that very first morning outside the feed store. I promise the same, Abigail answered, and I promise never again to face a fight alone when I've got a man willing to stand beside me through every bit of it. They kissed to the sound of genuine cheering, 23 horses watching curious from the nearby pasture fence, and Abigail felt standing there in her mother's altered wedding dress, with Jesse's mother's ring on her finger, that she had built something even more lasting than a saved ranch. A family stitched together from grief and stubbornness and shared purpose, exactly the kind her father would have recognized and blessed had he lived to see it. The ranch itself continued to grow across the following 2 years, its reputation spreading well beyond Silver Creek as word traveled about the woman who'd turned worthless horses and ruined swampland into proof that nothing was ever quite so hopeless as it first appeared. Neighboring ranchers struggling with their own flooded or drought-stricken acreage began arriving with cautious requests for Samuel's expertise, and Abigail found herself almost without deciding to expanding beyond her own 100 acres into something closer to a mission, restoring buried drainage on 3 neighboring properties within 18 months, each project employing the same method that had saved her own land horses, walking loose and instinctive across ground that hid old secrets beneath its surface. Never expected to spend my later years teaching half the county to trust their own horses' judgment over their own eyes, Samuel admitted one evening sitting on the Calloway porch, for that was what folks had taken to calling it now, though. Abigail still thought of it quietly as her father's porch too, watching sunset paint the restored pasture gold. But I find I don't mind the work near so much as I minded the years before it sitting idle and waiting to be useful again. You're the reason any of this worked, Mr. Brooks, Abigail said. Don't think I've forgotten that whatever else has happened since. Nor have I forgotten a woman brave enough to trust an old man's strange theory about drainage tile and blind mares when the whole rest of the county thought her mad for even trying. He raised his glass slightly, a small private toast. Your father would be proud, Mrs. Calloway. I hope you know that. I do know it, she said softly, and found she believed it fully without the sharp grief that thought would once have carried. I think about him every time I walk that bottomland, and I think for the first time since he died that I'm not simply carrying his memory forward. I'm continuing his work. There's a difference, and it's taken me 2 years to understand it properly. Tut. The rescued horses, meanwhile, had become something of a signature across the whole territory. Ranchers as far as 50 miles distant sending word when they had animals too old or broken for conventional use, trusting that Carter Ranch, now Calloway Ranch, though old habits of naming died slow in Silver Creek, would find purpose in creatures everyone else had already written off. Jesse took to this expanded rescue work with an enthusiasm that surprised even Abigail, spending increasing time riding the territory to collect animals nobody else wanted, always returning with some new story about an owner's gratitude or a horse's particular stubborn character that reminded him, he admitted more than once, of the very woman he'd married. You've got a reputation now, too. You know, Abigail told him one evening, watching him work with a newly arrived gelding whose previous owner had simply turned loose to starve rather than pay for its keep through a hard winter. Folks call you the man who finds what nobody else believes is worth finding. Learned that particular skill from my wife, Jesse said, not looking up from his careful work with the frightened animal. Watched her find drainage under 30 years of mud and justice under 2 years of lies, and figured if a woman could manage all that, the least I could do was learn to find a little worth in animals other folks had already given up on. Their work together over those 2 years saved considerably more than horses. Word of the fraud exposed at Carter Ranch had traveled far enough that other railroad companies wary of similar exposure. quietly reformed practices across half the territory. Several banks implementing new policies requiring judicial review before any foreclosure proceeding could advance policies that Mrs. Delacroix's husband, chastened by his wife's earlier shame over the industry's conduct, championed loudly and publicly, becoming something of an unlikely reformer within regional banking circles. Even the county's attitude toward struggling families shifted slow but genuine in the wake of everything Abigail's fight had exposed. Neighbors who might once have simply watched a failing ranch fall to foreclosure without much thought now organized more readily to help where they could. A change several old-timers attributed directly to watching one stubborn widow proved that community effort applied with enough persistence could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Bashotag. It was in the third spring after the wedding that Abigail found herself standing once more in her father's study notebook, open before her. Though this time, the study belonged as much to Jesse now as to her his own boots and hat, resting by the door alongside hers, in a domesticity she still occasionally found herself marveling at. She was adding to the notebook now a habit she'd started shortly after the trial concluded, recording not just her father's original observations, but everything that had followed the drainage system's full restoration. The fraud exposed and punished the families helped the horses save the marriage, built from shared struggle into something steadier and more permanent than either of them had dared hope for that first cautious morning outside the feed store. Jesse found her there. Notebook open, evening light slanting gold through the window, and came to stand behind her chair reading over her shoulder with the easy familiarity of 2 years' shared life. "Writing your father's story into a happy ending," he observed. "Writing it into a beginning more like." She set down her pen, leaning back against him, feeling his arms come around her with the same steady comfort they'd offered from nearly the very first week they'd known each other. Papa's sentence wasn't really an ending, Jesse. It was an invitation. He didn't know how the water would find its way. He just trusted that it would give it enough patience and enough willingness to look for it properly. And now I think I understand what he meant better than he understood it himself, writing it in those final shaking months. The land wasn't the only thing that had forgotten where to go. So had this whole town in a way forgotten how to trust what looked broken, forgotten how to see worth past first appearances, forgotten that sometimes the very things everyone else has given up on are exactly the things capable of saving everything if somebody's brave enough to look close. She turned in his arms to face him fully. That's what this ranch taught me in the end. Not just how to save land, but how to see clearly again after grief had convinced me I'd lost that ability entirely. Jesse was quiet a moment, something thoughtful and tender in his expression. "Speaking of things nobody else believed in," he said, finally, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Dr. Ashford came by this morning while you were out checking the north fence." "Oh." "Confirmed what you'd been suspecting these past few weeks." His smile widened, joy breaking through the careful casualness of his tone. "We're going to have a child, Abigail, come winter by his reckoning." The notebook slipped forgotten from her lap as she came fully into his arms, tears of pure joy. This time, none of the grief that had shadowed every previous tear she'd shed in this house. "A child," she repeated, wondering, disbelieving, despite already having suspected it herself. "Jesse, we're going to have a child." "Reckon your father's notebook's going to need another chapter yet," he said, laughing through his own emotion, holding her close. "This land's just getting started, giving back everything it once seemed determined to take away." 10. The baby came in December, a healthy daughter. They named Grace Elizabeth Calloway, the first name in honor of the Mercy. Abigail had shown Reed, and the second in memory of her own mother, and the child grew up across the following years, surrounded by 20-some horses that seemed somehow to understand instinctively they were meant to be gentle with the small girl who toddled fearlessly among them from nearly the moment she could walk. Samuel, entering what he cheerfully called his second retirement from active drainage work, took to teaching young Grace everything he knew about listening to what the ground and the animals had to say, a skill she absorbed with the same natural curiosity her mother had once brought to a desperate gamble in a laughing feed store. "She's got your stubbornness," Jesse observed one afternoon, watching 4-year-old Grace attempt with fierce concentration to lead old Bess, now well past 30, and moving slower than ever, but still beloved beyond measure, across the pasture on her own small terms. "She's got yours too," Abigail said, smiling. "God help this county when she's grown." The years that followed brought their own share of ordinary struggles, a hard winter that tested the ranch's resources, a bout of illness that frightened them both before passing without lasting harm. The small daily challenges of running a growing operation that now employed 6 hands and stretched across nearly 300 acres, much of it reclaimed from swampland, using techniques Samuel had documented meticulously before his own health began, gently to decline. He passed peacefully in his sleep the winter. Grace turned 7, having lived to see his life's forgotten expertise transformed into a legacy that stretched across half the territory. Drainage systems restored on nearly a dozen properties, using methods he'd first tested on Carterland, with nothing but an old blind mare and a desperate widow's faith to guide him. Abigail spoke at his funeral, standing before a crowd that had grown to include families from 3 counties whose land Samuel's knowledge had helped save. Everyone in this county once thought this man's expertise belonged to a forgotten era. She said, her voice steady, despite the grief she felt keenly. Real grief this time for a friend who'd become as close as family across the years. Thought drainage engineering was some outdated skill nobody needed anymore. Same as everyone thought 20 broken horses were worthless. Same as everyone thought I'd lost my mind entirely standing in a feed store demanding help. Nobody believed I deserved. She looked out at the gathered mourners, so many of them touched directly by Samuel's quiet, patient genius. Samuel Brooks taught me the deepest lesson of my life, and I don't believe it was really about drainage tile or buried channels at all. He taught me that nothing is ever truly finished. Being useful, not land, not animals, not people, written off as too old or too broken or too strange to matter anymore. Sometimes, the most valuable things in this world are simply waiting, patient as buried stone for somebody willing to dig deep enough to find them. Butterfly. Grace grew into a young woman who split her time, much like her mother, before her between fierce practicality and genuine tenderness toward every broken thing that crossed her path. By the time she turned 16, Callaway Ranch had become something of a legend across the territory, not just for the fraud it had exposed or the drainage system it had restored, but for the simple, enduring principle it had come to represent, that value wasn't determined by first appearances, that redemption remained possible for land and animals and people alike, given enough patience and enough willingness to look past what the world had already decided to dismiss. Reed, released after serving 4 years of his sentence, wrote to Abigail occasionally in the years that followed. Letters that spoke of a quiet life, rebuilt honestly working as a bookkeeper, for a small mercantile, in a town 2 counties distant, far from any position of power over other people's desperate circumstances. She answered each letter never with warmth exactly, but with the same measured grace she'd shown him from the very start, acknowledgement that a man could do genuine wrong and still, given the chance, find his way back toward something better. Coy Danvers, meanwhile, had stayed on at Callaway Ranch permanently, growing from a frightened young man into a capable foreman. Jesse trusted completely his own courage. That long-ago night having become the foundation for a life he'd never expected to build, one rooted in the same principle that had saved the ranch itself, that speaking truth, however costly, mattered more than the comfortable safety of silence. The gray gelding, the one saved from fire, the one everyone had once called the most worthless of the 20 rescued horses, lived to a healthy old age, becoming eventually Grace's own first horse, a fitting inheritance for a girl raised on stories of the animal's quiet, stubborn courage the night the barn burned. And Bess, blind and beloved, lived long enough to see her own small legend cemented into local memory, the horse who'd stamped her hoof against buried brick and changed everything that followed. Memorialized eventually in a small wooden marker, Jesse carved himself and placed near the main drainage chamber, reading simply, "She found what everyone else had given up looking for." Abigail stood at that marker one evening, many years later, Grace grown now, and managing much of the ranch's daily operations herself. Jesse's hair gone gray, but his hands still steady, still gentle with every animal that crossed their gate. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments, of that first desperate morning in the feed store, of the laughter that had followed her out into the street, of the notebook sentence that had seemed at the time like nothing more than a grieving old man's confused final thought. The land isn't dead. The water simply forgot where to go. She understood now with the clarity that only decades of living could provide, that her father had never really been writing about drainage at all. Not entirely. He'd been writing about faith itself, about the stubborn essential belief that nothing valuable is ever truly lost, only waiting buried and forgotten for someone brave enough to dig until they found it again. 20 broken horses had taught an entire county that lesson, one careful hoofstep at a time. A blind mare had found buried brick beneath 30 years of mud and proven that worth doesn't disappear simply because the world stops looking for it. A grieving widow had walked into a laughing feed store and walked out decades later having transformed not just her own ranch, but the fortunes of 24 families and the conscience of an entire territory. The land had never truly been dead. It had simply been waiting, same as the horses, same as the truth buried in Reed's ledgers, same as the love that had grown slow and steady between two people who'd met over 4 abandoned draft horses, and a stranger's quiet refusal to laugh when everyone else did. Nothing worthwhile is ever finished being worth saving. That was the truth. Abigail Carter Calloway had proven standing in mud and fire and grief, and finally gloriously in triumph. And it was the truth she intended to keep proving every single day, for as long as she drew breath upon this land, her father had loved enough to trust, even when trusting it seemed like the greatest foolishness in the world. The water had found its way. The horses had found their home. The land had remembered, and so at last completely and forever had she.